factory, they had a very small turbocharger, no intercooler, so when the turbo gets hot... Hey, this is Matt's Garage, and I want to talk to you about turbocharging on a budget. Budget boosting. We're going to talk about that today. Right here, one of the first easiest things to budget boost is find a car that already has a turbo and then bring out its best. Put what the factory did not put on there. Like for example, this is a 1986 Nissan 300ZX Turbo. From the factory, they had a very small turbocharger, no intercooler, so when the turbo gets hot, your engine starts to detonate and you have pretty low performance. But then again, from the factory, the boost is probably only set at 6 or 7 pounds, which is like, you're barely boosting. So from the factory, they don't boost that high. There's an example of a factory Nissan 300ZX Turbo. The only things that have been done to this one is intake and exhaust tuning. But as you can see from the factory, no intercooler. Just a pipe going from the turbocharger, which is so far down there you can't even see, straight to the intake. So there's no intercooling here. So you're limited on how long you can run your engine or how hot you can get your engine and run your boost higher than stop, because you're going to detonate. So where this one isn't, eventually this will get an intercooler, but for now, it's just got an intake and exhaust to just make it get the best miles per gallon and the best with the factory boost that it has right now and the factory turbo. So it's just been lightly massaged. Where this one, this C here, I've brought everything the factory did not do. For example, down here where you, if you can see, way down here is a TO4E turbocharger. In the Nissan 300ZX Turbo, they put the turbo so low and out of view you can barely even see the intake tube. And you can see the exhaust if you look way down in there. But they tucked this turbo in so deep that I had to take the turbo partially apart just to fit it down there and then put it together once I got it attached to the flange. That's how hard this turbo upgrade was. So basically what I did is I took a factory car that came with a factory turbo and put the largest turbo I could fit in there, which is this TO4E. And I put a front, well, I call it, it's not really a front mount intercooler because I didn't want everyone to see my intercooler like everybody does. I kind of tucked it kind of back of the radiator, and I made an intake duct going to the intercooler. So basically I have kind of a front intercooler. It's in front of the engine, but it's not in front of the car. So I have an intercooler that I didn't have from the factory. So this car is now has a boost controller as well. This allows me to adjust my boost by turning, it has an internal wastegate, and I can adjust the boost by turning it counterclockwise to increase, clockwise to decrease boost by controlling its wastegate. And what the wastegate does is bypasses exhaust from the turbocharger. When you get enough exhaust to spool your turbo where you want it, you can dial your boost up and get it where you want it, and as soon as the exhaust spins the turbo as fast as you get, and you get a controlled boost level, like say 10 pounds, then the rest of the exhaust will bypass the turbo and go right out the pipe by way of the wastegate. That way you don't get your turbo spooling too fast and blow the heads off your engine, blow your head gaskets, melt your pistons, all that good stuff. Because a car cannot handle the full spinning of the turbo because it's too much. There is such a thing called too much boost. And if you get too much boost for what your engine can ingest, you blow it up. So you don't want to do that. Okay, we've talked about this 300ZX Turbo, and you can see it's pretty far from stock. And there again is our stock 300ZX Turbo with a couple little mild upgrades, like say electric fans, so we're not using the mechanical fan. So basically the engine doesn't have to work as hard. It's got an intake and exhaust. Real simple stuff. Basically, good bang for the buck. Very good budget turbo tuning here, but what's left to be done is a wastegate controller, of course, and an intercooler and a larger turbo. That's what's eventually going to be done to this, but it's not too bad as it is now. I'll start the engine and let you hear it a couple revs. Boat stock, you won't really hear this car very much, but as you can tell, it isn't completely stopped. That's basically a stock 300ZX with an intake exhaust and electrical fan upgrade. Breathes real good. Here's the Z that I've turbocharged, intercooled. I put a larger than stock turbo on there because the stock's just a T3. This is a T04E. A nice intercooler in the front, variable boost controller, electric fan, and she runs a lot better than she did from the factory. I'll let you hear this one. Love the squeaky fan belts, This is also the car we used for the burnout demonstration and all the little fun we had before I started this video. We used this car as our demo burnout power model. Used it to show and display some of the power a turbo can really bring out a car. I showed you a small demonstration of what a little bit of boosting, some budget boosting can do. Just basically taking a turbocharged car that came factory with the turbo, but you're bringing it out. You're bringing it out its max. You're bringing out more boost. You're putting a bigger turbocharger on it, an intercooler, and you're really waking up this factory car. Because from the factory, they put way too much stuff on. For example, this 1980 280ZX. You look at this engine right here. Very complicated. They just overcomplicated this engine. Just look at this thing. Look at all these lines everywhere. A lot of these you really don't need, except for the emissions people love them. See, because when they start going bad, you have to spend all kinds of money per hour to get all these little things fixed. But you can improve upon them, which I will show you in my 79 280ZX example. Okay, so right now we're in front of my 1979 Nissan 280ZX, which I converted to a turbo. And as you can see, it's nowhere close to the stock appearance of the 80 280ZX that you see there. Right now you're looking at a 2.8 liter inline six with a lot of head work, bigger cam, much larger valves. I put pretty much the best of the best on this L28 engine. And instead of the fuel injection, that complex fuel injection you saw in the other car, I've got this mighty demon 650 double pumper blow through turbo carburetor, which makes turbo tuning very easy, because when you're trying to tune for boost, you just rejet the carburetor. You don't need a laptop, you don't need all these ROM chips and all this crap. All you need is this carburetor. You take off the sides and you rejet them. If you're running lean, then you jet up a few numbers, which is more rich. Being a little bit rich is a lot better than being a little bit lean, because lean blows engines, melts pistons, blows heads, all that bad stuff that we don't want to do as boost junkies like we are. We're boost crazy. We like boost. In boost we trust. In thrust we trust. Back to this engine. This engine also has the same turbocharger as that red 300ZX turbo. You can see this turbo a little bit better on this straight 6 model. You can see the turbo compressor right there. And there's where the line comes from the intercooler, or actually it comes from the turbo's compressor to the blow-off valve, to this big large intercooler, which is an aftermarket Nissan Skyline GTR XS Power intercooler, which is the biggest one I could fit in this Z. I had to build the bumper around this intercooler. It's that big. But the cooling effectiveness is unbelievable. You can feel this car after a long, hard, hot run. This side of the intercooler's hot, this side's ice cold. So it works like you wouldn't believe. It really chills that boosted air, the high compressed boosted air, and shoves it into this carb hat right here. And that evenly distributes the boost together, shoves it in this blow-through carburetor. It mixes with the fuel, gets thrown in the engines when the intake valve opens up, and bam, your compression raises from your stock 9-to-1 compression on this engine and raises well above that. Like, this engine boosts around 18 pounds right now. I can have it boost higher, but I have it regulated around 18 pounds of boost, which is more than enough to smolder those 255 tires on the back. Leaves them in smoke. Well, I've talked a little bit about this car. This is a blow-through turbo setup. A lot of people don't do blow-through setups. A lot of people do fuel injection turbocharging, like say this Buick Grand National right here. This is a very fine example of a fuel-injected, turbocharged, intercooled monster. These cars were the fastest thing that existed when I was a senior in high school back in the late 80s, 87 to be exact. And this car was the fastest car of 1987. And of course it was the last year they made them, and then they quit making them, but they've become very popular after that because they're rare and bone stock. They put out a lot of power and a lot of torque. And the way this one's modified, it's modified to the tune of about 650 horses and about close to 700 pounds of torque. It's a little monster. It's got this T66 turbocharger. There's the turbo compressor right there. And from there it goes to this front mount intercooler right here, which you can see in the front of the car. Big, largest front mount intercooler you can fit in this car. And then it comes from the intercooler to the intake manifold, into the throttle body intake manifold, where it's met by the fuel injectors injecting fuel, air, compressed air and fuel mixed together, shove it in the engine, compression, power, exhaust. And the exhaust is what drives this turbocharger. Think of a turbocharger as a supercharger, except instead of being driven by a belt like a supercharger, it's driven by exhaust gases. It's driven by waste exhaust gases to make more power in your engine. This turbo setup also has a variable boost controller right here. If you can look, this turbo shows an example of an external wastegate. I talked to you before about internal wastegates. They're attached to the turbocharger. This is an external wastegate and directly regulates the exhaust that's not used to spin the turbo, regulates it down to the downpipe, through the muffler, and out the exhaust system. So whatever's not being used to spool the turbo, when it's regulated to the 22 pounds of boost I run in this right now, when it's regulated to 22, anything more than that, any more exhaust flow, is directed from the wastegate out the pipe. So basically just enough exhaust is used to spool the turbo the boost levels you want. This is a beast. Probably the fastest automatic car I've ever driven or owned. Now we're going to talk about a real popular car that they made in the late 80s, early 90s from Japan. A 1990 Mitsubishi Eclipse GSX all-wheel drive turbo. So not only are you turbocharged, this one is far from stock. This is a fine example of a factory turbocharged car that somebody put the right turbocharger on, an external wastegate, boost controller, adjustable fuel pressure regulator, because you want your fuel to go up with your boost. So this is a big must. Then you've got your custom turbo header, which leads right to this turbo exhaust. It runs this turbo. There's a little shaft between the exhaust and the intake of the turbo, which spools the turbo compressor, sucks fresh air from that air cleaner, compresses it into this front mount intercooler, shoves it, gets it cool, then shoves it in the intake, more compression, more power, bam! The thing's gone. Takes off like a cat shot, because it's all-wheel drive, very little spin, let out your clutch at just under red line, wham! Slam you in the back like a cat shot from an aircraft carrier. I used to live on a few aircraft carriers, and I have taken quite a few cat shots. It's hellacious velocity. Gotta love it. Another turbo example I'm going to talk about, very popular these days. Turbo diesels are immensely powerful and popular nowadays. Just a simple, innocent 2005 Ram right here with the Cummins 24-valve turbo diesel engine. It's got the front mount intercooler right here. The turbocharger you can see right down here. It's a whole set turbocharger. You can bring it in and see. This turbocharger is a beast from the factory. At idle, this thing puts out 15 pounds of boost at idle. I've sat there and watched my Predator tuner, looked at it, go, damn, 15 pounds of boost right from the factory at idle. Then you get on the throttle and you easily see 50 pounds of boost just going down the road. And it just gets better as the throttle goes down and the fuel pump opens. All right, this turbo diesel, very high torque, unbelievable amounts of torque, a lot more torque than it has horsepower. Like a lot of these engines here put out more horsepower than torque. But the turbo diesel, for this example, with the tuner, the straight exhaust, the intake, all the tuning I've done to this diesel, it's at 800 pounds of torque and 500 horsepower. So you can see on this example, the torque well exceeds the horsepower on turbo diesel projects and turbo diesel tuning. Turbo diesel tuning has come quite a great way from the 80s and 70s, back when people used to pass diesels in the slow lane, emitting all kinds of black smoke and going slow. That's a thing of the past. Ever since they maximized turbo diesel and boost on a diesel engine, turbo diesels are passing everybody up the mountain road. Wow, this turbo diesel's a beast. Oh wow, this thing can really get your heart rate going when you're into it. Wow, turbo diesel power, torque. This is a 2000 Dodge Ram 2500. It has a inline 6 Cummins turbo diesel with a single turbo, whole set turbocharger, turbocharged, intercooled, has a 6-speed manual transmission. This thing's a beast. You don't want to be in front of it when it's charging like a freight train. 300-pound bumper. This engine puts out 500 horsepower, 800 foot-pounds of torque. Another car we covered today, 1990 Mitsubishi Eclipse GSR. Basically in Japan, these were kind of like the Evolution. The Evolution started off in Japan in the late 80s. And this is what came to America. The only version of it that ever made it until the early 2000s when they finally brought the Evos over. It took a long time for them to do that. But this is a fine example of what turbocharging, intercooling, and taking a stock factory car and bringing out its best with turbocharger, intercooler, external wastegates, bigger fuel injectors, adjustable fuel pressure regulator, blow-off valve, all kinds of goodies that make this car 500 horsepower and around 400 pounds of torque at the higher RPMs, of course. Then we're back to this monster 1987 Buick Grand National. This was a legend back in the 80s and still a legend today. Not too many people know what they are, but us older guys that have been around, oh, we know all about the interesting bad black Buicks. They're monstrous. This thing, the way it sits right now, is around 650 horsepower, about 550 pounds of torque. Turbocharged, intercooled 3.8 liter V6, madly boosted, madly modified. Big cams, big turbo, large intercooler, huge injectors. I really can't count all the things I've done. There's so much modifications in this car. There's probably at least $8,000 just under the hood right now, and I'm not even done yet. I'm still cooking away at it. We're going to talk about this 1979. We've already talked about this Z. 1979 Nissan 280ZX, which I made into a 280ZX Turbo. I basically took all these parts, I got a part here, a part there, a part here, a part there, and put it all together. I basically made my own turbo kit, my own setup, blow-through, turbo, carbureted, intercooled, inline 6, 2.8 liter, turbocharged, intercooled, TO4E turbocharger, variable wastegate controller. It's got all these goodies, 3 fuel pumps on this thing to feed this hungry engine, this hungry demon 650 Mighty Demon blow-through double pumper carburetor, a monster. If I want to get more fuel, I change the jets. If I want less fuel, I reduce the jets. I go up to get more rich, go down to get more lean. Real easy. You know, always go a few jets higher on the primaries than the secondaries, because your primaries is your main, and then when you get to the floor, your secondaries open up, you want a slightly smaller jet on the secondaries, because you don't want to overfuel it, then you're going over rich and you're losing horsepower and torque. The way this engine sits right now, it's putting out a good 500, because these inline 6s put out a gobs of torque, and the horsepower is around 500, and the torque should be right around 500 with it. It's a monster. And we showed you a stock 280ZX Turbo. This is bone stock from the factory, 1980, Nissan 280ZX, non-turbo. They also made them turbocharged from the factory, but just like the 300ZX Turbo, these never came with intercoolers. So that's what I did on my 280ZX. I put an intercooler on it. Every turbo I like to have an intercooler on there, because you can get on the gas, you can get on your throttle a lot longer and have cool air going into the engine. That's important. It's better fuel atomization, much better power, and you can make a lot more boost reliably with an intercooler than without. Because without an intercooler, the engine gets too hot, and after so much heat, so much boost, so much detonation, bye-bye valves, bye-bye pistons. They'll melt, blow head gaskets. Very ugly for us boost guys. All right, now I'm back to the stock 300ZX Turbo, 1986. 300ZX Turbo. But what I forgot to mention real fast, bone stock 280ZX. Natural aspirated, would you believe, puts out 135 horsepower and about 200 pounds of torque. That's about what this puts out. A lot of torque, but not a lot of horsepower, because back in the 80s, they were focused on emissions controls. That was like the most important thing for the manufacturers, trying to comply with all these, in my opinion, ultra-anal emission controls. They're way too stingent, and they take away power and gas economy. Unfortunately, in most states, it's very touchy subject. But for purposes of racing purposes, you don't need them. If they're classics, you don't need them. Anything 76 or older, feel free to have a ball with them and race them out. Make them powerful. Have a good time. But you should always check your local state laws to make sure the modifications you're doing to your car are not excessive and don't push the boundaries of the law. So you always have to follow the law, but when you go to the track, that's another story. You can tune for power. But when you're on the street, just make sure you check your local laws to make sure that you're in compliance. You got your catalytic converter, things like that you have to have on your car to drive on the street. So make sure you're complying with all your laws, but you can have fun too when you go to the track. All right, I talked about this 300ZX Turbo, 1986. Stock except for intake exhaust, radiator fan, basically electric instead of mechanical, so it gives me a few bits of power. Nice free-flowing exhaust, free-flowing intake, improves the gas economy and the power. Fuel economy, power, and low-end boost. I showed you a sample of how this thing revs up. It spools up a lot better with just an intake and exhaust. Pretty much all I did to it. Now we'll talk about my final Z, another 1986 300ZX Turbo, which was a turbocharged car from the factory, but I just brought out the best I could bring out in it. Because from the factory, they were not intercooled. I put an intercooler in it. The factory had a very restrictive intake. I put a very free-breathing intake on it. The factory had a choking exhaust system. I freed it out with a nice free 3-inch exhaust system all the way in the back. So, breathes in and breathes out. Your engine breathes in efficiently, breathes out efficiently. Got power, torque, and much better fuel economy. This car is almost close to 35 miles to the gallon, the way it's tuned right now, the way the boost is set up. So you don't have to lose fuel economy because you're turbocharging. Just because you put a large turbocharger on your car doesn't mean you have to sacrifice fuel economy, because you can have it all. Our next videos are going to talk about different kinds of turbocharging. I like carburetors, so I'm going to talk about two kinds of carburetor turbocharging. You've got draw-through carbureting and blow-through carbureting, like that 79 280ZX Turbo over there. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about regular turbocharging with fuel injection or with carburetors. I'm going to talk about the types of turbocharging, the types of components, and how to pick your own components and put them together and make your own turbo kit. Because we all know how expensive turbocharger kits come. If you buy the whole kit from somebody, you're spending upwards from $8,000 to $25,000. And that could be on the cheap side. I know there's even more companies that charge more than that to customize and turbocharge your engine. But if you have the basics and the knowledge, you can go on eBay and find turbos for this much, intercoolers for this much. You can go to another source. You can get online and shop for different turbos. You can go to a junkyard, find a diesel turbocharger, do a little research on the turbo and find out, hey, this turbo on this engine can make 600 horse with the right flow and boost. So all these basics that I'm going to cover on these videos are going to teach you how to pick your components, and you can make your own turbo kit and save tens of thousands of dollars by making your own budget boosting. Thanks for coming to Mad Matt's Garage, and you have a great day, a great boosting day. Thank you for joining us today on our budget boosting video. Just remember, all the cars that we had as demonstrations today, they are actually running cars that are registered, insured in our city and state. And we like them. They move. And they are real examples of what budget boosting can do for you. Please check your local state and federal laws to make sure everything you do to your car is good to go in your area. Also, if you like us on Facebook. Like us and post us. Recommend us to your friends. If you feel like you learned something today, share it. Share the knowledge, because knowledge is power. In our case, horsepower. Join us again for our next, when we talk about blow through, draw through, and different methods of turbocharging your beast for monstrous power. Thank you.